All right, today we're diving into what was basically a high-stakes chess match played out in 18th century India. We're talking about the First Anglo-Maratha War. This is a fantastic story of a powerful local empire going head-to-head with a rising global power, and it's full of ambition, betrayal, and some truly brilliant strategy.
So that really brings us to the core question, doesn't it? How on earth did the Maratha Confederacy, a regional power, manage to hand a truly stunning defeat to the seemingly unstoppable British Empire? Well, the answer is a masterclass in deception, and it's all about exploiting your enemy's weaknesses while playing to your own strengths. So, let's break it down.
To really get how this all kicked off, we need to understand the two main players on the board, the English East India Company and the incredibly powerful but kind of fractured Maratha Confederacy. And you know, both sides were actually dealing with their own internal divisions, which played a huge role in what was about to happen.
Okay, so you've got to remember, the British weren't just traders at this point. They had a playbook for expansion. They'd seen massive success in Bengal, and the English over in Bombay were basically just itching for a chance to copy that model of control. They were on the lookout, just waiting for any sign of weakness, any crack they could exploit to expand their influence.
And boy, did they get their chance. It all came in the form of a messy succession crisis. The Peshwa, who was the prime minister and for all intents and purposes the ruler of the Maratha Confederacy, died in 1772. This kicked off a wild domino effect. His brother was assassinated. Then his uncle, Raghunathrao, grabs power for himself. But then, to make things even more complicated, a legitimate heir is born after his father's death. Suddenly you've got two rival claimants to the throne. Chaos.
Now, Raghunathrau's power grab didn't sit well with everyone. Not by a long shot. A powerful group of 12 Maratha chiefs, led by this really sharp minister named Nana Padnavis, formed a council to rule in the name of the infant heir. And this deep internal division, this was the exact opening the British had been waiting for.
So with his claim to power suddenly looking pretty shaky, what does Raghunathrao do? He turns to the British for help, for military support. And this desperate alliance, well, it was the spark that would light the fuse for a major war.
This led to something called the Treaty of Salbai. Think of it as a deal with the devil. In exchange for 2,500 British soldiers to back his claim, Raghunathrao agreed to just hand over valuable Maratha territories. For the British government in Bombay, this was perfect. It was the pretext they needed to get involved directly in Maratha politics.
But here's the twist. The Marathas weren't the only ones who were divided. The British themselves were a mess. You had the Bombay government supporting Raghunathrao, but their bosses over in Calcutta absolutely condemned the deal. In fact, they went and signed their own treaty renouncing him. But Bombay just straight up ignored them. It was a completely contradictory and chaotic policy.
And you can bet this British infighting didn't go unnoticed. In 1777, Nana Padnavis saw this chaos and made a brilliant geopolitical move. He granted Britain's biggest rival, the French, a port right there on the west coast. This was a massive poke in the eye to British interests, and it basically forced their hand. They had no choice but to send a military force toward the Maratha capital, Pune.
So, war is now officially on. The British army is advancing toward Pune, totally confident in their military superiority. But they weren't marching into a straightforward battle. Oh no, they were walking straight into a devastatingly clever trap.
And the architect of this incredible trap was the Maratha general Mahaji Scindia. Now, he was smart. He knew he couldn't beat the British firepower in a head-on conventional fight. So he came up with a strategy to use the terrain, the one thing he knew better than them, to his advantage.
Let's just break down his genius four-step plan. First, he lured the British deep into these winding, treacherous mountain passes known as the Ghats. Then, step 2, he trapped them, completely cutting off any chance of retreat. Next, he went after their supplies, attacking their main base. And finally, the finishing blow, a scorched earth policy. His forces burned farmland, poisoned wells, and destroyed everything in the British path. The British army was left stranded, surrounded, and literally starving.
The result was an absolute catastrophe for the British. They were completely cut off, no food, no water. They were forced to surrender at the village of Wadgaon. The mighty British Empire had been totally outsmarted and utterly defeated.
And the terms of that surrender, which were laid out in the Treaty of Wadgaon, were a huge victory for the Marathas. The Bombay government was forced to give back every piece of territory they had gained since 1775. It was an incredible humiliation, a stunning reversal of fortune.
But the story doesn't end there, not even close. While the Marathas were celebrating their victory, they seriously underestimated the resolve of the British. The defeat at Wadgaon was an insult the empire was not going to let stand. Way back in Calcutta, the Governor-General Warren Hastings was absolutely furious. He saw the Treaty of Wadgaon as a total disgrace. He just flat-out rejected it, and then he escalated the conflict massively, sending multiple armies to attack the Marathas on all fronts.
And this British counterattack was swift, and it was brutal. Within just 2 years, they'd captured key cities like Ahmedabad and Bassein, seized the legendary Gwalior fort, and even defeated Mahaji Scindia's forces in a major battle. Just like that, the tide of the war had completely turned.
So after years of this intense back-and-forth fighting, both sides were just exhausted. The British had proven they were superior in an open battle, but the Marathas had shown that they were an incredibly resilient and formidable opponent. It was finally time to talk.
The war officially ended with the Treaty of Salbai in 1782. So let's quickly run through the key terms. The English got to keep the strategic island of Salsette, which was super important for defending Bombay. Most of the other territories they'd conquered were handed back to the Marathas. And Raghunathrao, the guy who started this whole mess, he was pensioned off, completely abandoned by the British. The Marathas agreed not to get cozy with any other European powers, and Mahaji Scindia himself, the general who trapped the British, became the guarantor of the peace.
And the result of this whole treaty? 20 years of peace. For 2 whole decades, a pretty uneasy truce held between the British and the Marathas. It created a whole new status quo in the region, at least for a while.
Which brings us to our final thought here. The treaty did end the war, and it brought a long period of stability. But really, given the massive ambitions of both sides, was it a true diplomatic success? Or was it just a 20-year ceasefire? A long pause before the inevitable next round in the fight for control of India? That's definitely something to think about.